Section 1. Winter is coming. The spirit of the North. There is something about the North that stays with you, long after the dragons are gone, long after the wars have quieted, long after the last whispered promises have faded into the cold air of memory. The North endures. It always has. And somewhere at the heart of that endurance, carved into the very stone of the oldest castle in the Seven Kingdoms, lives the family whose story we are about to follow through 8,000 years of history. Not 100 years, not 1,000, 8,000. A lineage so deep it predates the written word, so ancient that its origins blur into the dreamlike territory where history and myth decide they cannot be separated and simply walk away holding hands. House Stark of Winterfell, the kings of winter, the wardens of the North. Their words are three simple syllables that carry the weight of an entire philosophy. Winter is coming. It is a warning dressed as a motto, a reminder dressed as a warning, and a way of life dressed as all three. Every other great house in Westeros speaks of their own glory, of growing strong, of hearing us roar, of fire and blood. But the Starks have always looked north and inward, toward the cold that presses down from beyond the wall, toward the patience that the frozen earth demands of anyone who would claim to rule it. They have never boasted. They have only prepared. Before we descend into the specifics of dates and battles and the kind of heartbreak that this particular family seems to attract the way flames draw moths, it is worth sitting for a moment with what House Stark actually represents in the world of Westeros. They are, in nearly every way that matters, the soul of the old world. The world that existed before the Andals came south with their swords and their seven-pointed sties, before Valyrian dragon lords cast their shadows over the continent, before iron thrones and golden lions and all the machinery of southern politics. The Starks are first men, among the oldest bloodlines on the continent, carrying in their veins the memories of a time when the line between the human world and something older, stranger, and profoundly more powerful was razor thin. They come from the land itself, is what I mean to say. When the first Stark ancestor knelt by a weirwood tree in a godswood, we cannot quite picture anymore. The roots of that tree were already ancient beyond imagining. The children of the forest, those small, mysterious, green-eyed beings who inhabited Westeros before humanity arrived, had been carving faces into the weirwoods for thousands of years by that point. And the Starks forged a relationship with that older world, with those old gods, that no amount of Targaryen conquest or Andal conversion ever fully severed. Even at the end of the story, even after everything this family endured, one of their own sat woven into the roots of all that old memory, seeing with 1,000 eyes. There is something almost geological about the Starks. Like the granite of Winterfell's walls, they do not bend dramatically or shatter neatly. They absorb, they persist, they crack in ways that look catastrophic, and then, somehow, the stone holds. What we are going to do tonight is trace all of it, from the very beginning, which means going so far back that we will be walking through the smoke of legend before we reach anything written down, all the way through to the last moments of the story, where the family that nearly ceased to exist somehow found itself again. We will meet the man who built the wall. We will stand with the last king in the North, as he looked upon dragons for the first time and made a choice that would shape his entire bloodline for 300 years. We will walk the halls of Winterfell with Eddard Stark and feel, in his bone-deep sense of honor, everything that is beautiful and everything that is ultimately doomed about trying to be good in a world that punishes goodness. We will follow his children apart and through darkness and back toward each other. But before all of that, just for a moment, close your eyes and picture Winterfell. Not the castle under siege or in flames or half ruined. The castle as it is on a quiet morning before the wars arrived. Smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the godswood still and green at the heart of it, the great white weirwood tree wearing its carved face with something between sorrow and serenity. Hot springs warming the stones beneath your feet, even as snow falls outside the walls. Ravens in the towers. A gray direwolf somewhere in the yard, and in the crypts below, stretching down through levels of dark stone further than anyone has ever properly mapped, the carved faces of kings whose names we can barely remember, but whose blood runs forward through time and into every story we are about to tell. This is where it all begins. Not with a battle or a betrayal, but with a place that is, in ways the story keeps insisting upon, alive. And so, with that image settled, let us begin. If you are watching this, I want to know. Drop a comment below telling me where you are in the world and what time it is. Whether you are drifting off in a bed somewhere cold, riding a night train, or just looking for something calm to settle your thoughts. I love knowing where these stories travel, and if this is your first time here, welcome. Go ahead and subscribe. There is a great deal more lore where this is coming from. Section 2. The Age of Heroes. Bran the Builder. The further back you go in the history of Westeros, the stranger and more uncertain the ground becomes beneath your feet. The Meisters of the Citadel, those careful and often deeply skeptical scholars who have spent centuries trying to impose a kind of rational order on the chaotic human story, have a term for the earliest period of Westerosi history. They call it the Age of Heroes. It is the age that follows the long peace between the first men and the children of the forest. That remarkable moment when two very different peoples who had been at war with each other for centuries simply stopped and agreed, along the shores of the God's Eye Lake, to share the world rather than destroy each other over it. This peace is called the Pact, and everything that came after it, before the Long Night and the horrors that arrived with it, is roughly what we mean when we say the Age of Heroes. What makes the Age of Heroes distinct from the periods that follow it is this. Almost nothing from this era is documented in the conventional sense. There were no written histories, the first men had no written language to speak of, and the children of the forest communicated in their true tongue, a language that very few humans could understand. What we have instead are stories, songs, fragments of legend passed down through so many generations of mouths that by the time a Meister finally wrote any of it down, 6 or 7 or 8,000 years had gone by, and the line between what happened and what people needed to believe had long since dissolved. Brandon Stark, known as Bran the Builder, is the defining figure of this age when it comes to House Stark. He is, by all accounts and traditions, the founder of the house, the first king in the north, and the man responsible for 2 of the most remarkable structures in the history of the known world. He is also, depending on who you ask and how charitable you are feeling toward the limits of legend, possibly several different people whose deeds were folded together over time into a single superhuman figure. George R.R. Martin himself has acknowledged this ambiguity, noting that we cannot say with certainty whether Brandon the Builder ever truly lived as a single person or whether he is a composite myth. But let us treat him as real because his story is too important to let epistemological uncertainty dissolve it. And besides, there is a version of this, a version the story itself seems to quietly endorse, where questions of whether he was real miss the point entirely. What Bran the Builder built was real. The Wall is real. Winterfell is real. Whatever specific hands actually did the work, the vision and the will that drove its creation came from somewhere, and the legend says it came from him. According to the tales, Brandon Stark was born during or shortly after the Age of Heroes' most turbulent early years, when the first men were still settling into the peace with the children that the Pact had established. His lineage, in the way of all legendary figures, is something scholars argue over with genuine heat. Some stories from the Reach, that fertile southern kingdom whose own legendary history connects to the mythical figure of Garth Greenhand, claim that Bran the Builder was a descendant of Garth through a son known as Brandon of the Bloody Blade, a man who earned his unsettling nickname by driving giants from the Reach. If this lineage is accurate, then Bran the Builder was not purely of northern stock at all, but rather a man who came into the north and claimed it, who took the name Stark and made it mean something. Stark. It is worth pausing on the word itself. Stark. It is an old word, a direct word, a word that means bare and without ornament, exposed to the wind. There is no softness in it. It is precisely the kind of name you would give yourself if you wanted the world to understand, in a single syllable, something essential about your character and your intentions. What we know, or what legend insists we know, about Bran the Builder's achievements is extraordinary by any measure. The first and most intimate of them is Winterfell itself. The castle that would become the seat of House Stark for the entirety of the family's existence was raised by Bran, with the assistance, and this detail matters, of both giants and the children of the forest. Stop on that for a moment. The founding of this family's home required the cooperation of three different kinds of beings: the first men, the ancient giant folk of the north, and the children of the forest, who had been weaving magic into the world since before humanity arrived on the continent. It was a collaborative act of creation, which is perhaps why Winterfell always felt like more than just a castle. The location itself was chosen with purpose. Winterfell sits above a network of hot springs, those underground rivers of warm water that circulate through the rock beneath the castle and have heated the granite walls for all 8,000 years of the family's residence. This is not coincidence. Whoever chose the site understood what those thermal springs meant for a people living in the northern cold. Warmth that does not depend on firewood or the mercy of summer, warmth that comes from the earth itself. In the long winters that could last a decade or more in Westeros, that warmth was not merely comfort, it was survival. The castle that rose over those springs was massive from the beginning. Towers and keeps and great halls, walls of pale gray stone that became darker and more complex with each generation that added to them, crypts that descended into the rock below the castle, in levels that even the Starks themselves stopped fully mapping at some point. Because the oldest levels were so ancient, they had become genuinely mysterious. By the time the story we know begins, Winterfell is not so much a castle as an accumulation of 8,000 years of decisions about where to put things. The Godswood at its heart, 10 acres of old-growth forest preserved inside the walls, with a white weirwood at its center whose carved face predates the castle around it, is not merely decorative. It is a functioning religious site, a place where the old gods can hear prayers, and where the boundary between the physical world and the Greenseer network woven through the weirwoods is thinner than it is almost anywhere else. But Bran the Builder's greatest achievement was not Winterfell, as impressive as that is. His greatest achievement stands 300 miles to the north, and it stands 700 feet tall, and it is made of ice, the Wall. We will discuss the circumstances that required the Wall in the next section, when we talk about the Long Night and the First War against the Dead. But let us speak here about the Wall as an engineering and magical achievement, because it is, even viewed purely technically, almost beyond comprehension. A barrier of ice and stone stretching for 300 miles across the northern throat of the continent of Westeros, from the shivering sea in the east to the gorge and the Bay of Ice in the west. Its average height is around 700 feet. Its average width at the base is roughly 300 feet. The sheer volume of material involved in its construction is staggering enough when you consider that this is mostly ice. But the Wall is not ordinary ice. Anyone who has placed a hand on it can feel that there is something different about it, something that keeps it from melting in summer the way it should, something that makes it resistant to fire in a way that no natural ice could be. That difference is magic, ancient, deep, pre-human magic, woven into the structure during construction by the children of the forest who helped build it. The legends say that Bran himself learned the true tongue of the children specifically so he could communicate with them during the building process, so he could understand what spells were being laid into the ice and why. This detail, a man learning an entirely different language to ensure the right magic was used in the Wall's construction, tells you something important about Bran the Builder's character as the legend presents it. He was not a man who delegated the parts he did not understand. He was a man who made himself understand. What the magic in the Wall was meant to accomplish, beyond the obvious physical barrier, is something the story reveals only gradually. There were wards laid into the ice that had nothing to do with stopping human armies. The Wall was built to keep out something that was dead, or more precisely, something that used the dead as its instrument. The others, those pale, cold beings from the uttermost north who had nearly extinguished human life during the Long Night, could not pass the Wall as long as the magic within it held. This was not a coincidence of geography. It was an intentional design, a piece of magical architecture as much as a physical one. The Wall's creation also came with a companion institution. The Night's Watch, that ancient brotherhood of men who would guard the Wall through all the centuries to come, was founded at roughly the same time, and the land immediately south of the Wall, a stretch 25 leagues wide that came to be called the Gift, was bestowed upon the Night's Watch by the Starks to support their operations. Some Meisters argue that the specific Brandon who gave this land to the Watch was a different King of Winter than the one who built the Wall, pointing out that a man who built the Wall in the distant past could not also have made this grant closer to written history. Others say this misses the point, that multiple Brandons might have carried forward the work of the original, and that the tradition of Stark supporting the Night's Watch began with the builder himself and continued in his name. There is also a persistent and intriguing legend that Bran the Builder advised in the construction of other remarkable structures across Westeros. Storm's End, that impossibly storm-battered castle on the coast of the Stormlands, whose walls have stood against the fury of the ocean for thousands of years, is said to have been built with Bran's counsel. Some accounts say he was present as a boy when Doran, the first Storm King, struggled to build something the sea would not tear down, and that it was young Bran's suggestions that finally resulted in the structure that held. Similarly, the High Tower of Old Town, that enormous lighthouse tower rising from the mouth of the Honeywine River in the heart of the Reach, has legends attached to it that involve the same builder. Whether any of this is literal history, or whether it reflects a more complicated truth, that a tradition of extraordinary building associated with the name Brandon Stark became the way people in various parts of Westeros explained structures whose origins they could not otherwise account for, is genuinely unknowable. What is certain is that the founding act of House Stark was an act of creation. Before the wars, before the politics, before the tragedy, there was a man who looked at the world and decided to build something that would last. His descendants would spend 8,000 years proving that he succeeded. Section 3. The Long Night. When darkness came, to understand House Stark, you have to understand what the Wall is for. And to understand what the Wall is for, you have to go back further than Bran the Builder, back past the founding of Winterfell, back past even the pact between the first men and the children of the forest, to a period so remote and so catastrophic that the people who survived it could barely describe it in words that made sense, and their descendants have been arguing about what exactly happened ever since. The Long Night. The name alone carries a weight that the oldest stories always earn by understatement. It was not just a night, of course. It was a season that lasted a generation, a winter so total and so vast that the sun disappeared for years and the world came as close to ending as it has ever come. At least, that is what the legends say. The Meisters are skeptical, as they are skeptical of everything that predates their written records. They will acknowledge that something unusual happened in the distant past, that there are consistent echoes of a great catastrophe in stories from every culture in the known world, from the legends of Yi-Ti in the Far East to the stories of the Ibbenese whalers, from the Ondal traditions that came later to the oldest preserved memories of the first men. Something happened, something large and dark and cold. In the Westerosi tradition, the Long Night was the arrival of the Others. The Others, called White Walkers in the later popular understanding, are beings of ice and cold and some kind of dark magic that the living world has no settled framework for comprehending. They came from the uttermost north, from a place beyond the Wall that even the Night's Watch called the Lands of Always Winter, a region so frigid and so inhospitable that nothing living has ever successfully mapped it. They came during a period when winter was already stretching toward a length that no living person had seen, when the cold had settled over Westeros so completely that the distinction between seasons ceased to have practical meaning. They brought the cold with them, or they were the cold made conscious and malevolent, or they were something for which cold is only a metaphor. The stories do not agree, and perhaps the people who experienced the Long Night were too busy surviving it to take careful notes about the metaphysics. What is consistent across all the versions is the army that accompanied them, the dead. The Others raised the corpses of those who died in the cold and sent them walking, endlessly, against the living. Not mindlessly, there was strategy in it, there was something that looked from the outside like purpose, but with an absence of the mercy or negotiation that even the most violent living adversary eventually offers. The dead kept coming. They could not be wounded in ways that mattered. They did not tire or lose heart or retreat. They simply advanced. The world almost ended. What stopped it, what at the last moment gave the living their chance, is the War for the Dawn, the mythic battle in which the heroes of the Age of Heroes made their final stand and, somehow, won. The precise details of how the Others were defeated have been lost to time, though the story preserves fragments. There were heroes with legendary weapons. There was a figure called the Last Hero who walked into the cold seeking the children of the forest and the secret of how to fight back. There is a persistent legend of a weapon called Lightbringer, a sword drawn from the body of a dying woman, or forged in the fires of a star, depending on which tradition you are consulting. And there is the dragon glass, the obsidian that cuts the others like nothing else can, that the children of the forest pointed the last hero toward, and that the Night's Watch would spend the next 8,000 years forgetting to stockpile. For House Stark specifically, the Long Night is not merely distant history, it is the entire reason for their existence as a ruling house, the founding trauma from which everything about them follows. Bran the Builder did not construct the wall because he enjoyed large infrastructure projects. He built it because he had seen what came from the north, and he understood that the victory of the War for the Dawn was not the end of the threat. It was merely a reprieve. The others had been driven back, but not destroyed. They were waiting, in the cold, in the darkness. And someday, in some winter that no living person yet knew about, they would come again. This is where the Stark motto acquires its full weight. When later houses of the South heard, "Winter is coming," and took it as a simple acknowledgement of seasonal change, they were hearing words stripped of their original context. In the original context, "Winter is coming" was a warning about something specific and existential. It was saying, the world has ended once already, and it can end again, and it is our responsibility to remember that even in the warmth of summer, perhaps especially in the warmth of summer, when it is easiest to forget. This is also why the Night's Watch mattered so much to the Starks. Every generation, the Kings of Winter and later the Lords of Winterfell sent men to the Wall. There was a tradition, described in the earliest records of the Watch, in which the Stark household sent one man and 10 to the Night's Watch at the onset of every winter, not as a punishment, not as exile, but as a duty, an acknowledgement that someone had to stand watch even when there was nothing visible to stand watch against. The Night's Watch at its height was a prestigious institution, its members drawn from the nobility as well as the general populace, its black cloaks a mark of honor rather than shame. Over the thousands of years between the Long Night and the events of the story we know, as the memory of the first great catastrophe faded, and the Watch dwindled, and the world south of the Wall convinced itself the stories were children's stories, the Starks maintained the tradition when nearly everyone else abandoned it. There is something lonely and admirable and ultimately tragic about this. The family that built the Wall never stopped believing in what the Wall was for, even when the rest of Westeros had long since decided the Wall was a historical curiosity and the Night's Watch was a repository for criminals and exiles. The Starks kept sending their sons north. They kept their Godswood green and their Weirwood active. They kept saying winter is coming, even when every other house found it vaguely eccentric. And then winter came. It came not in the era of Bran the Builder, but 8,000 years later, in the time of the children and grandchildren of Eddard Stark, in a world that had spent 3 centuries forgetting how to be afraid of the right things. When it came, the family that had been built to face it was fractured and scattered, half of them dead, the other half scattered across the length and breadth of the known world, on journeys whose significance they did not yet understand. They were always meant to face this. Everything else, the wars and the politics and the love stories and the betrayals, was what happened to them on the way there. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We have 8,000 years to travel through first. Let us keep moving. Section 4, 8,000 years. The Kings of Winter, the period between the construction of the Wall and the arrival of Aegon the Conqueror, spans approximately 8,000 years, and the Stark family reigned over the North for the entirety of it. Let that duration settle for a moment. 8,000 years of a single family holding a single territory. For comparison, the entirety of recorded human history as we experience it in the real world, from the earliest Sumerian city-states to the present day, covers roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years. House Stark's unbroken rule over the North is older than everything we have ever written down about our own civilization. Most of those 8,000 years are dark to us, in the sense that the records are fragmentary at best and entirely absent at worst. What we know comes from the genealogies preserved in the crypts of Winterfell, from fragments referenced in much later texts, and from the oral traditions maintained by houses like House Reed, whose people the Crannogmen kept their own histories separate from the Maester-dominated record-keeping of the South. It is enough to give us shape and character, even if the fine details are lost. The title itself tells us something important. King of Winter. Not King of the North, not at first. King of Winter. It was both a geographic designation and a philosophical statement, an acknowledgement that the man who ruled the North ruled the season that defined it. The cold was not their adversary, the cold was their domain. In those early centuries, after the long night had passed and the immediate existential crisis was over, the North was not a unified territory. It was a collection of smaller kingdoms, petty lordships, and independent peoples who had survived the darkness in their various corners of the continent and were now trying to work out what peace looked like. The Starks of Winterfell were one of these powers, but they were not the only one, and they were not initially the largest. Their rise to dominance in the North was the work of generations and was achieved through a combination of war, diplomacy, and what we might call strategic marriage, all three of which the early Stark kings pursued with the same patient thoroughness that would come to define the family's broader character. They fought the Barrow kings of the South, ancestors of House Dustin, for control of the territories around Barrowton. They contended with the Marsh kings, who controlled the boglands south of the Neck, and who relied on that impassable geography to maintain their independence. They dealt with the Red kings, ancestors of House Bolton, who were a persistent and troubling presence in the east of the North, and who had a tradition of flaying their enemies that spoke to something fundamental and unpleasant in their character. The Boltons deserve particular attention, because they are not simply a historical footnote. The relationship between House Stark and House Bolton runs like a dark undercurrent through the entire history of the North, a relationship defined by genuine antagonism and genuine danger that lasted for thousands of years before one side finally destroyed the other. The ancestors of the Boltons were the Red Kings of the Dreadfor, and for 1,000 years they waged war with the Starks in what the histories describe as a conflict of particular ferocity. At various points, the Red Kings captured Stark kings and held them prisoner. At various points, the Starks retaliated with the kind of thoroughness that northern warfare has always been distinguished by. Eventually, after a very long time, the Boltons submitted, but they never fully became something other than what they had always been. The Warg Kings of the Western Lands are another fascinating chapter in the early history of the North. These rulers, whose title tells you something important about the magical traditions that persisted in the North long after they faded elsewhere, apparently had the ability to enter the minds of animals, to see through their eyes and direct their actions. This warging ability is something that certain Stark children would display thousands of years later, and the connection is suggestive. When the Stark kings finally conquered the Warg Kings' territories, they did not simply kill the ruling family. They took the Warg Kings' daughters as wives, deliberately incorporating that bloodline and its gifts into their own. This is one of the stranger and more interesting things about the Stark approach to conquest in those early centuries. They did not simply win and move on. They absorbed what they found. The magical traditions of the peoples they defeated were not discarded as threats or heresies. They were folded in. The Stark bloodline became something composite over thousands of years, carrying in it the memory of every people the North had incorporated. The warging gifts from the West, the ferocity of the hill clans in the mountains, the water magic in the veins of the few families with old ties to the Priandal Riverlands who came north rather than submit to the new faith. The North is, in this sense, a palimpsest, an old document written over repeatedly with traces of all the previous writing still faintly visible beneath. The Stark kings during the middle millennia contended with challenges that ranged from the mundane to the genuinely supernatural. There were the Winter Kings in the far north, who are mentioned in only the most fragmentary records, rulers of the lands closer to the Wall, who may have had their own traditions, their own relationships with the old magic, their own complicated feelings about the institution the Starks represented. There were periods when the Night's Watch itself became a political issue, when the Watch's decline in numbers and prestige created problems for the northern boundary that the Lord of Winterfell had to address diplomatically or militarily. There was the Night King of the Watch, a different Night King from the supernatural entity of the White Walker army, this one a human, the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, who, according to legend, fell in love with a female White Walker and brought her to the Night Fort, and under her influence declared himself king and began practicing dark rituals, ruling for 13 years until Bran the Builder and a king beyond the Wall named Jorah Moon brought him down together. This legend is worth sitting with for a moment, because it contains something important about how the Stark family understood the dangers that their guardianship was meant to protect against. It was not only that the others were an external threat, it was that the Wall and the Night's Watch, the very institutions created to contain that threat, could themselves be compromised by it from the inside. Power corrupts, and the power of the Wall, the magic in it, the sense of absolute separation it represented, the isolation that came from guarding it, could corrupt the men who held it. The story of the Night's Watch is in part a story of an institution trying and often failing to remain true to its original purpose across thousands of years of institutional drift. One of the most evocative figures from these middle centuries of Stark history is Cregan Stark, who ruled during the period of the Dance of the Dragons, the great civil war between the Targaryen factions that tore the family apart roughly a century and a half after Aegon's conquest. Cregan is remarkable for a number of reasons, not least of which is the way he embodies the Stark approach to obligation, even when the specifics of that obligation are being debated across the entire realm. When the dance began and the various factions competed for northern support, Cregan negotiated a pact with Prince Jacaerys Velaryon, the eldest son of Rhaenyra Targaryen, who was arguing her claim to the throne, that became known as the Pact of Ice and Fire. Cregan agreed to provide northern forces in support of Rhaenyra's cause, in exchange for certain agreements about the relationship between the North and the Iron Throne going forward. He raised an enormous host, tens of thousands of northern soldiers, and marched them south. He arrived too late for the actual war, which had concluded in tragedy before his army reached its destination. But his arrival fundamentally changed the political calculus of the aftermath. The period after the dance that historians call the Hour of the Wolf is essentially Cregan Stark serving briefly as the hand of the king and using that position to ensure that the promises made to the North and to the dead were honored. He conducted a series of trials of people who had betrayed or murdered during the conflict. He maintained the dignity of the Watch as an institution. He established precedents for how northern interests would be treated in the context of the Iron Throne. Then he went home. He had no interest in the permanent exercise of Southern power. He had come south to honor an obligation, and he discharged it. And he left. This is such a Stark thing to do that it almost works as a definition of what a Stark is. They come when they are needed, they do what needs to be done, they go home. The centuries between Cregan and Rickard are less documented, but the general pattern holds. Stark lords coming of age, learning the territory, managing the North's enormous internal complexity, maintaining the Wall's staffing when the Watch was embarrassingly under strength, fighting off occasional incursions from both South and North, raising children who would do the same. The North's isolation from the larger politics of Westeros was both a protection and a limitation. It kept the Starks out of the worst of the Targaryen civil wars and succession crises. It also meant that when events finally pulled them into southern politics with Rickard's generation, they were somewhat unprepared for just how different the rules were down there. This was a pattern the Starks repeated with several conquered families, and it tells us something important. They were not simply conquerors. They were builders of a people, incorporating what they defeated rather than simply erasing it. The North that Eddard Stark rules at the start of the story is not a monoculture imposed by conquest. It is an accumulation of different peoples and traditions and bloodlines that the Starks spent thousands of years weaving together. The Umbers with their rage, the Mormonts with their ferocity, the Manderleys who came north after being expelled from the Reach and built White Harbor into a real city, the mountain clans of the northern hills, the Crannog men in their bogs, all of these peoples became part of the North, and the Starks became the point around which they oriented themselves. There is a tradition in the North that does not exist anywhere else in Westeros, and it speaks directly to this sense of mutual belonging. The oath of fealty sworn to the Starks by northern lords is not merely political, it is something closer to personal. When a northern lord swears his sword to Winterfell, the understanding on both sides is that the Starks will remember their service, will protect their people, will be the kind of lords worth dying for. And when that understanding is honored, it creates a bond that outlasts individual kings and survives political catastrophe in ways that the purely transactional loyalties of the South never quite manage. We see this play out in the story itself, over and over. When Robb Stark calls his banners, they come. 20,000 men marching south because a Stark called for them, not because they were compelled to. When Jon Snow needs to retake Winterfell from the Boltons, Houses Mormont and Mazin march under a 10-year-old girl's banner in his name. When the North needed to announce its independence, it did so unanimously in a single hall because the Stark loyalty was not to a kingdom, but to a family. And as long as even one of that family survived, the North considered itself obligated. 8,000 years of keeping promises built that. During those long centuries, the North developed its own distinct culture in ways that set it apart from everything south of the Neck. The Faith of the Seven, that religion imported from Essos by the Andal invaders who conquered the south, never took hold in the North. The Andals themselves, for all their military success in breaking the kingdoms of the south one by one, stopped at the Neck and went no further. Whether this was because the North's geography made conquest impractical, because the Starks were simply too formidable a military proposition, or because the Andals recognized that the North's old magic made it different in ways they could not easily overcome, historians and scholars have debated this for generations without reaching consensus. What matters is the result. The North remained First Men territory, its people still worshipping the old gods through the heart trees, still swearing their oaths under the watching eyes of the weirwood, still drawing something from that ancient network of carved faces and interconnected roots that the South lost when it burned its weirwoods to make room for a different faith. There is a story from this long middle period that deserves particular attention, one that is officially classified as a wild myth by the Meisters, but which persists with the kind of stubborn vitality that true stories have. The legend of Bael the Bard. It goes like this. A wildling warrior and singer of extraordinary reputation, Bael the Bard, came to Winterfell and challenged the then king in the north to give him whatever prize he asked if Bael could compose a song that pleased the king. The king agreed. The song pleased him. Bael asked for the most beautiful flower in Winterfell, and the king, believing this to mean something from the gods would, agreed. That night, Bael stole away with the king's only daughter and hid her, unnamed, for a year and a day, right there in the crypts of Winterfell under the king's nose, where she bore a son. This son was eventually raised as the heir of Winterfell, and the line of kings continued, unknowingly carrying wildling blood in it. Whether true or not, the legend suggests something interesting about how the North understood its own history. Mixed, complicated, never entirely as pure or as certain as it presented itself to be. The crypts of Winterfell are themselves a chapter of history that deserves care. Far below the castle, level upon level descending into the bedrock, the carved figures of the kings of winter sit upon their granite thrones in the dark. Each one holds an iron longsword across his lap, a custom whose origin is lost, but whose explanation the old stories provide. The iron sword keeps the spirit of the dead king in his crypt, prevents it from wandering, gives it something to focus its strength on, so that it does not trouble the living. The oldest figures at the deepest levels are rough work, barely recognizable as human, their features worn smooth by time until they look almost like something other than people. The swords beside them have rusted to nothing, just red-brown stains on the stone. Further up, the work becomes more refined, more individually human, the faces gaining particularity and expression. What the crypts represent, in a way that is not merely metaphorical, is the accumulated weight of all those thousands of years. The Starks are not just a family living in a castle. They are a family that lives above its own history, that descends into that history regularly, that keeps its dead close and present in a way that no other house in Westeros does, quite so literally. When young Bran Stark dreams of the crypts, he is not just dreaming of a spooky underground place. He is dreaming of the entire span of what his family is and has been, calling to him from the stone. The Stark kings during this long middle period fought off incursions from beyond the wall, kept the peace among the various peoples of the North, dealt with the occasional internal rebellion, watched the Night's Watch decline from a powerful institution to a threadbare one, without ever quite stopping their own contributions to it. They were not perfect. Some of them did terrible things, as the stories quietly acknowledge. But they endured and they maintained, and when the Andals remade the South into something new, and the Dragon Lords of Valyria rose to reshape the entire Eastern world, the North just went on being the North. Those gray stone walls, and that pale weirwood, and those deep crypts, unchanged and unchangeable, until the day the dragons came. Section 5. The King Who Knelt. Torrhen Stark and Aegon's conquest. In the year that would eventually be marked as the year zero of Westerosi recorded history, zero before conquest, the moment from which all subsequent dates are measured, three dragons crossed the narrow sea from the volcanic island of Dragonstone and changed the world. Aegon Targaryen was not the first Valyrian dragon lord. He was not even the most powerful in the absolute sense. But he was the one who looked west across the water at the patchwork of squabbling kingdoms that made up Westeros and decided that he was going to do something about it. Whether this ambition was purely personal or whether it was driven by a prophetic dream, a vision that Aegon passed down to his heirs under the name of Aegon's Dream, a vision of an ice-cold apocalypse coming from the north that could only be survived by a united Westeros led by a single power, is something the full story reveals only much later. What we know is that he came with his two sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, each mounted on their own dragons, and that within 2 years he had burned his way through most of the southern kingdoms. The Field of Fire, in which approximately 4,000 Gardner and Lannister soldiers were burned alive in a single engagement, established beyond any possible doubt what resistance to the Targaryen dragons meant in practical terms. The Gardners, who had ruled the Reach from Highgarden for millennia, were extinguished as a ruling house in that single battle. Their line simply ended. The message was stark, to use the word deliberately: bend the knee or be ash. One by one, the great houses of the South bent. The Lannisters. The newly elevated Tyrells, who had been the Gardner's stewards and who now received the lands their former masters had surrendered. The Arryns of the Vale, the Tullys of the Riverlands, the Baratheons of Storm's End. Even Dorne, which resisted by other means, refusing pitched battle, relying on the desert and guerrilla tactics that dragons were ill-suited to defeat, eventually came to a different kind of accommodation with the Targaryens, though that took another century and a great deal of additional suffering on both sides. But the North had not yet been addressed. The North, separated from the South by the vast boggy expanse of the Neck and its protective barrier of towers and reeds and lethal terrain, managed by the Cranogmen of House Reed, had watched Aegon's conquest proceed. And Torrhen Stark, king in the North, had been watching very carefully. Torrhen was a formidable man. He was the last in a line of 8,000 years of kings, and he knew it in every bone. The forces he assembled when Aegon's conquest turned its attention northward were substantial, 30,000 men, which the chroniclers note was actually a larger force than Robb Stark would later manage to gather when he marched south in his own war, because Torrhen had time to send riders across the vast distances of the north and summon the bannermen properly. 30,000 hardened northern soldiers, armed and armored and deeply motivated to defend a homeland that had never been conquered. Torrhen marched them south. He crossed the Neck with his entire host and came down into the Riverlands, and he took up a position on the north bank of the Trident, the great river that runs through the heart of Westeros. Across the river, on the south bank, was Aegon's army, augmented now by the forces of houses who had already bent the knee, swelled to perhaps 50,000 soldiers of mixed motivation. And flying above it, 3 dragons: Balerion, the Black Dread; Vhagar; Meraxes, the 3 great war beasts of the early Targaryen conquest, the largest of which, Balerion, was so enormous that his shadow could cover entire towns when he flew over them, whose flame was black and whose name was a shadow of something older even than the Targaryens themselves, drawn from the memory of an ancient Valyrian god. Torrhen camped on the north bank for a night. Some accounts say 2 nights. Whatever the exact duration, he spent that time in council with his lords and his sons and the half-brother some chronicles mention, a bastard named Brandon Snow, who reportedly offered to swim the river under cover of darkness and assassinate Aegon with the 3 sharpened weirwood arrows he carried. Torrhen refused this offer. He spent that night thinking about what he knew and what he had seen. He knew what had happened to the armies that faced those dragons. He knew what the Field of Fire meant. He knew that even 30,000 brave northern soldiers marching in perfect formation represented nothing more than 30,000 people who would die in fire if those 3 creatures launched into the air above them. And he knew something else, something that later history suggests may have been explicitly communicated to him across the river by Aegon himself. The Targaryens were not coming to destroy the North. They were coming to unite Westeros against something that the Starks, alone among the great houses, had always believed in. Whether Aegon's dream was explicitly shared with Torrhen that night, whether the Targaryen king told the Stark king that the wall needed to hold, and that a united Westeros was the only hope of holding it, is something the historical record is tantalizingly vague about. What House of the Dragon later suggests is that yes, this communication happened, that Torrhen bent the knee, not merely out of pragmatism, but out of a recognition that the Targaryen cause and the Stark cause were at their roots the same cause. They were both, in their different ways, trying to prevent the world from ending. The next morning, Torrhen Stark rode south across the Trident. He knelt. Before 30,000 of his own soldiers, before the assembled host of a conqueror who had just redrawn the map of the world, the last king in the north removed his crown and placed it at a Targaryen's feet. He rose as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. The men who watched, his sons, his bannermen, the soldiers who had marched south in the cold expecting to fight and die, called him the king who knelt. Some said it with contempt, with the particular bitterness of men who felt their lord had stolen from them a glorious death. Others said it differently, with something that was not quite admiration but was adjacent to it, an acknowledgement that the man had made a choice that preserved 30,000 lives and kept the North intact as an entity. Robb Stark, thousands of years later, would evaluate his ancestors' decision clearly. Torrhen saved thousands of lives that day. His detractors forget they are only alive because of what he did. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific nature of what Torrhen chose to sacrifice. He sacrificed the title. He gave up the crown that had passed through his family for 8,000 years. The crown of bronze and iron, an ancient custom that had been the symbol of northern independence since before the Andals arrived in the south. He did not sacrifice the North's identity, its culture, its religion, its way of doing things, its internal governance structures, or its relationship with its own people. He traded sovereignty for continuity, and the continuity proved durable enough that 300 years later, the North would reclaim the sovereignty. There were Northerners who refused to accept this bargain. A group of men and women, the chronicles say soldiers, but also accounts mention women, suggesting this was not purely a military response, who could not accept bending the knee to a foreign conqueror, formed a sellsword company called the Company of the Rose, and went into exile across the narrow sea. They would rather leave the North than live in it under a foreign overlord. Torrhen's own sons had doubts, the histories hint. Some of them spoke of rebellion, of raising the Stark banner and undoing what their father had done. Torrhen either persuaded them or outlived them, and the rebellion never came. The immediate practical consequences of the submission were managed well. Torrhen was given real authority in the North. He was not reduced to a puppet. He was made a lord paramount, which in practice meant his governance of the North continued as it always had, with the addition of taxation flowing south to King's Landing, and certain decisions requiring the Iron Throne's approval that previously had not. The wall remained under Stark patronage. The godswood remained untouched. The old gods were not persecuted. The Stark family remained the first family of the North, undiminished in local authority. In the years that followed, Torrhen demonstrated the same quality that his capitulation had shown, a willingness to be practical about what the situation required. When Aegon needed someone to suppress the Sistermen's rebellion, a challenge to Iron Throne authority in the islands off the eastern coast, Torrhen sent his man to handle it. He contributed longships to various projects. He did what a loyal vassal did, without resentment and without the performative loyalty that masked opposition. He had made his choice and he lived by it. The Starks who came after Torrhen served the Iron Throne loyally. Not without occasional friction, the Targaryens extracted taxation, made demands, periodically stripped land from northern territories to fund the Night's Watch over Stark objection, but with a fundamental commitment that held across 3 centuries. They remained the Wardens of the North, the Lords of Winterfell, the great house of a vast territory, diminished in the sense of sovereignty, but not in the sense of identity. The North remembered what it was. It just chose, for 300 years, to express that identity within a larger structure. There is a poetic justice in the fact that it was the Starks' own memory and the Targaryens' own failings that eventually caused that structure to collapse. But that story belongs to another generation. Section 6. Rickard, Brandon, and the Seeds of Revolution. For 300 years, the Starks served, lords of Winterfell, wardens of the North, loyalists to the Iron Throne through Targaryen conquest and Targaryen civil war and Targaryen madness, through the Dance of the Dragons and the Blackfire rebellions and all the other turbulences that rattled the realm periodically like storms that knock things off shelves but do not bring the house down. And then came Lord Rickard Stark and the world he inhabited, and a series of events so catastrophic in their speed and finality that it is almost impossible to track them without feeling something catch in your chest. Rickard Stark was the father of Eddard, Brandon, Lyanna, and Benjen. He was, by the accounts that survive, a politically sophisticated man by the standards of northern lords, which is to say he was unusual. Where most Stark lords kept their focus firmly on the north, on the bannermen, on the wall, on the internal business of a vast territory, Rickard had ambitions that looked southward. He wanted the Starks to become a genuine great power within the context of the Seven Kingdoms, not merely the largest fish in the northern pond. To this end, he engineered a series of marriages and alliances that connected House Stark, for the first time in its long history, to the web of southern politics in a serious way. His heir Brandon was betrothed to Catelyn Tully, daughter of the Lord of Riverrun, making the connection between North and Riverlands something formal and dynastic. His daughter Lyanna was betrothed to Robert Baratheon, the heir of Storm's End, a powerful lord of the Stormlands with a lineage that included Targaryen blood through his grandmother and the kind of martial reputation that made him one of the most talked about young men in Westeros. His younger son Eddard was fostered in the Vale at the Eyrie, in the household of Lord Jon Arryn, where he grew up alongside the young Robert Baratheon, forming the deep friendship that would eventually anchor the rebellion that changed the world. This was strategic brilliance of a kind the North had not often attempted. Rickard was building a coalition, weaving together the North, the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Stormlands in bonds of obligation and family. What he was planning to do with this coalition, whether he had specific ambitions regarding the increasingly unstable Targaryen throne, or whether he was simply hedging against an uncertain future, is something we can only speculate about, because he was killed before he could do much of anything with it. King Aerys II Targaryen, called the Mad King, had been deteriorating for years by the time events reached their breaking point. The madness was not a sudden thing. It had been growing through decades of paranoia and grandiosity, and the particular instability that comes from a family that had been marrying brother to sister for generations in the sincere belief that it preserved the purity of their blood. It had been fed by a kidnapping during the defiance of Duskendale that left Aerys traumatized and suspicious in new and more dangerous ways. It had been sharpened by his growing fear of and resentment toward his son Rhaegar, who was popular and competent in everything a crown prince should be, which somehow his father experienced as a threat. The breaking point arrived through a tournament. The great tourney at Harrenhal, held in the year before the rebellion, was one of the largest gatherings of knights in a generation. Almost every great house sent their best, and the crowds were enormous, and the spectacle was everything a medieval tournament promised to be. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, that silver-haired, violet-eyed paragon who was widely considered the finest knight of his age, won the joust. And when the tournament custom called for him to crown the Queen of Love and Beauty, to choose a woman from the assembled crowd and place a wreath of flowers on her head as a public declaration of admiration, Rhaegar rode his horse past his own wife, Elia Martell, the Dornish princess who had given him 2 children and had every reasonable expectation of receiving this honor, and placed a crown of blue winter roses on the lap of Lyanna Stark. The crowd went silent, and as Ned Stark would remember it for the rest of his life, all the smiles died. Lyanna Stark was not just another noblewoman in the crowd. She was betrothed to Robert Baratheon, who was sitting in that crowd and watching what had just happened, and whose feelings for Lyanna were not casual. Robert Baratheon was genuinely, deeply in love with Lyanna, a love that by most accounts she did not fully return, having realistic doubts about whether Robert's famous appetites would confine themselves to a single wife once the romance of courtship had settled into the routine of marriage. But it was still her hand he was promised, and it was still her Rhaegar had just publicly singled out in front of everyone. Roughly a year after Harrenhal, Lyanna disappeared with Prince Rhaegar. The official story, the story that everyone in Westeros would believe for the next 20 years, was that Rhaegar had kidnapped and violated her, that the prince had committed an act of abduction against a highborn woman, a crime against House Stark, and a crime against her betrothed. This narrative was almost certainly wrong. What actually happened, as the story would eventually reveal through Bran's green sight thousands of years later, is that Rhaegar and Lyanna had fallen genuinely in love, that Rhaegar had his existing marriage to Elia Martell annulled. Whether this was legally possible in the way he thought is a question the Meisters would later argue about, and that he and Lyanna had married secretly in a ceremony in Dorne. Lyanna went willingly. The Tower of Joy in the Red Mountains of Dorne was not a prison. It was a home, however temporary, however hidden. But the world did not know this. The world saw a prince take another man's betrothed by apparent force, and the world reacted accordingly. Brandon Stark, Rickard's heir and Lyanna's elder brother, was a young man of considerable fire. He was passionate and physical in ways that his younger brother Eddard was not, more likely to act from feeling than from deliberation, more likely to demand immediate satisfaction for a wrong than to consider the larger implications. When word reached him that Rhaegar had taken Lyanna, he did not wait for political consultation or strategic planning. He rode to King's Landing. He stood in the courtyard of the Red Keep and shouted a challenge to Prince Rhaegar, demanding that the prince come out and face him. This was either the act of a brave man or a reckless one, and it may have been both. What it was not was successful. Rhaegar was not there, but Aerys was. And Aerys, increasingly paranoid and increasingly willing to see threats and provocations that previous kings might have dismissed as hot-blooded aristocratic bluster, had Brandon arrested immediately. He then sent for Lord Rickard Stark, commanding him to come to King's Landing to answer for his son's actions. Lord Rickard came. He brought 200 men. He demanded a trial by combat. What happened next was not a trial. It was a demonstration. Aerys, with the peculiar inventiveness that madness sometimes lends to cruelty, declared that he would honor Rickard's request for trial by combat by appointing his own champion. His champion would be fire. Lord Rickard Stark was suspended from the rafters of the throne room in his armor, and a fire was lit beneath him, and he was slowly roasted alive. Brandon Stark watched. He was restrained by a Tyroshi strangling device, a collar around his neck attached by a cord to a sword just out of reach. Brandon strangled himself to death, trying to reach the sword to cut himself free, while his father burned above him. Both Starks died. Two at once, father and eldest son, in a room full of witnesses, by the direct order of the king. Aerys then made his third catastrophic decision in rapid succession. He sent a message to Jon Arryn in the Eyrie, demanding that Arryn send him the heads of his two wards, Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon. What Aerys apparently did not understand, or did not care about, was what he was doing to his own support base. He had just murdered 2 members of one of the great houses. He was now demanding the murder of 2 more young lords who had powerful friends and nothing left to lose. Jon Arryn refused. He called his banners instead. Robert Baratheon called his banners. Eddard Stark, suddenly, devastatingly, unexpectedly the Lord of Winterfell and the head of his house, a role that had been meant for his elder brother and for which he had never been fully prepared, called the Banners of the North. Robert's rebellion had begun. Section 7, Eddard Stark, the man who was always north. To understand why Ned Stark's story lands as hard as it does, you have to understand what he was before he became the man the story requires him to be. He was a second son. He was quiet where his brother Brandon was loud. He was deliberate where Brandon was impulsive. He was a man who thought carefully about his words and meant the ones he chose, who held his own counsel, who felt things deeply but expressed them through action rather than declaration. He had been sent to the Vale at age 8 and raised there, far from Winterfell, in a household that was not his own, which forged in him both a deep love of home, of the specific, textured, remembered feeling of the North, and a capacity for loyalty to people who were not his blood, because the bonds formed in the Eyrie between Eddard and Robert and Jon Arryn were the defining bonds of his young adult life. He did not expect to be Lord of Winterfell. He had expected to grow up and be the second son, the one who rode at his elder brother's side, who served the family in a supporting role, whose name would be important but not primary. Brandon was supposed to be the one who carried the Stark line forward, who married Catelyn Tully and had children and made the strategic alliances their father had carefully arranged. Instead, in a span of weeks, Ned Stark went from being a young man living in someone else's household to being the head of his house, the Lord of Winterfell, and a commander in the most significant civil war Westeros had seen in living memory. He fought. He fought well and hard, at battles from the Vale to King's Landing. The kind of fighting that the histories record, but that leaves marks on people the histories do not bother to describe. He married Catelyn Tully not out of love, not initially, but because the marriage was already arranged, and because aligning the Tullys firmly with the rebellion required honoring the commitment, even now that it was his commitment rather than Brandon's. Catelyn had been grieving Brandon. Ned was not Brandon. The marriage they built was, by necessity, constructed on practicality and then, slowly, out of something real. They built it together, and it became real, which is a different path to the same destination. The rebellion's climax came at the Battle of the Trident, where Robert smashed Rhaegar's army and killed the prince in single combat, sending the Targaryen cause collapsing like a building whose main beam has been cut. And then came the Tower of Joy. Ned rode south with 6 companions. He found 3 members of the Kingsguard standing before a tall tower in the Red Mountains of Dorne, and he understood immediately that they were guarding something of tremendous importance. Kingsguard members did not leave the side of the king or the royal family for casual reasons. 3 of them standing in the middle of nowhere, guarding a tower, meant a Targaryen was inside. What followed was one of the most costly victories of the entire rebellion. The Kingsguard fought. They were among the best swords in the world, led by Sir Arthur Dayne, a man who was widely considered the finest knight who had ever lived, a man who wielded 2 swords and moved through the fight like something from a song. By the end of it, most of Ned's companions were dead, Arthur Dayne was dead, and Ned, surviving more through desperation and the help of Howland Reed's unexpected intervention than through matching Dayne's skill sword for sword, climbed the steps of the tower. He found Lyanna in a bed soaked with blood. She was dying. She had given birth, and the birth had taken something from her that she could not recover. The baby was alive, a boy. What Lyanna whispered to her brother in that room, her dying breath spent on a promise she needed him to keep, shaped the next 20 years of the war's aftermath and arguably the entire trajectory of the world's future. She told him the boy's name was Aegon Targaryen. She told him to protect the child. She told him that Robert, who was now the king, who had built his entire war on the story of Rhaegar kidnapping and violating his betrothed, who had ordered Targaryen children killed without compunction, would murder this baby without hesitation if he knew what he was. Promise me, Ned. He promised. It cost him something he valued almost above anything else, his reputation for absolute honesty. Ned Stark was a man whose word was his identity, whose honor was not merely a personal quality, but the organizing principle around which his entire life was arranged. He had to take his sister's child home and present that child to the world, including his own wife, who had every reason to suspect that this baby represented proof of her husband's infidelity, as his own bastard son, born of some nameless woman during the war. He had to lie. Not once, not with one small convenient untruth, but consistently and permanently, every day of his life, to everyone who mattered to him. He named the boy Jon, after Jon Arryn, his guardian and mentor. He gave the boy his sister's gray eyes and dark coloring, which helped the deception hold. He raised Jon at Winterfell alongside his own true-born children, treating the boy with love, but also with the particular caution of a man who knew the secret and knew what discovery would mean. He never explained. He deflected every question. He took the shame of apparent infidelity onto himself and bore it without complaint, because the alternative was the death of a child who had done nothing wrong. It was the greatest act of love in his life, and it destroyed a piece of his relationship with Catelyn, who could not bring herself to fully embrace the boy she believed was proof of her husband's betrayal, and whose cold distance from Jon Snow was one of the quiet, ongoing wounds in that Winterfell household. Neither of them knew. Catelyn because Ned kept the secret as he had promised. Jon because the truth of his parentage would have been death if it had become known. As Lord of Winterfell, Ned was precisely what the North needed, and perhaps what the South did not deserve. He was a just lord in the deepest sense, not merely in the procedural sense of following rules, but in the human sense of genuinely trying to see the difference between right and wrong and act accordingly. He judged his own men when they deserved judgment. He executed criminals personally with his own sword, because he believed that a lord who orders death should be willing to look it in the face rather than delegating the act to someone else and walking away with clean hands. This practice, riding out to some lonely stretch of road or field to deliver justice himself, was considered slightly eccentric in the context of Westerosi lordship generally, where execution was typically the work of headsmen. But Ned had a philosophy about it that went something like, "The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. If you cannot stand behind your own judgment in that way, perhaps your judgment deserves more examination than you have given it." He managed the North with a light hand and a consistent set of values that his bannermen could rely on. He was not beloved in the theatrical sense, not the kind of lord who gave feasts and speeches and made everyone feel personally appreciated. He was beloved in the quieter sense of being trusted, of being the kind of authority figure that people believed would act rightly, even when acting rightly was inconvenient. In a world where most authority figures acted in their own interest and dressed that interest in whatever language was required to make it presentable, this was genuinely rare. He was a good father, which is perhaps more important than anything else for the purposes of what came after. He was present. He trained with his children. He sat with them in the great hall and in the godswood. He taught by example rather than proclamation, which is always the more effective method. His sons and daughters absorbed from him a bone-deep sense that honor was not merely a social performance, but an actual way of navigating the world, a tool rather than a costume. Arya got his stubbornness and his fundamental seriousness about justice. Bran got something of his patience and his willingness to look difficult things in the face. Robb got his sense of obligation and his courage, and also his tendency to let that obligation override strategic calculation in ways that turned out to be catastrophically costly. Jon got his silence, his ability to hold a painful truth inside him and carry it as a secret, the way Ned had carried the secret of Jon's parentage for 15 years. Jon Snow never knew his father's greatest secret, but he inherited his father's greatest quality, the capacity to hold something terrible and important in his chest and keep walking forward, keep meeting his obligations, keep being present for the people who needed him, without letting the weight destroy him. The Greyjoy Rebellion of 289 AC was Ned's last major military action as Lord of Winterfell. When Balon Greyjoy, the Lord of the Iron Islands, a cold and proud man who had decided that the Targaryen dynasty's end in Robert's rebellion meant the Ironborn could reclaim their independence, raised his banners and declared himself king, Robert Baratheon called on his old friend Ned to join the campaign to suppress the rebellion. Ned came, as he always came when asked, and the rebellion was crushed with the kind of comprehensive efficiency that a well-organized coalition could manage against a force that was outnumbered and out-resourced. Balon's surviving son Theon was taken as a ward, the traditional insurance against future rebellion, the mechanism by which medieval lords guaranteed the good behavior of conquered rivals by holding their heirs in comfortable captivity. Theon came to Winterfell and grew up there, caught between identities, belonging fully to neither his blood family nor the adopted one, which would eventually produce a crisis with massive consequences for everyone involved. And then Robert came to Winterfell, and everything began to change. Robert Baratheon had been a great man once, and the weight of the throne had not been kind to him. He was fat where he had been powerful, drunk where he had been sharp, disappointed where he had been hopeful. He came north to ask his oldest friend to come south and serve as Hand of the King, because the previous Hand, Jon Arryn, had just died under circumstances that would turn out to be very much not accidental, and Robert needed someone he trusted in the position. He needed Ned. Ned did not want to go. Everything in him said not to go. He was a northern man in the deepest possible sense, not just geographically, but temperamentally, in his bones, in the way he thought about governance and loyalty and what mattered. The South was a different world, one that ran on a different set of rules, a world where the truth was an obstacle to be worked around rather than a foundation to build on. He knew this. He had seen it in the rebellion, in the sack of King's Landing, in the things that happened in dark corners while men with swords looked away. He went anyway, because Robert asked, because Robert was his king. Because something in Ned Stark could not refuse a direct appeal from the person he had fought beside and bled beside, even when every instinct said that this particular appeal was going to cost something he could not afford to pay. He left Winterfell with his daughters. He left Robb behind as acting Lord of Winterfell. He rode south into a world that did not share his values and would not honor his methods, carrying in him the secret of Jon's parentage and the certainty, growing stronger the further south he went, that the truth he was about to discover about what had happened to Jon Arryn was going to be dangerous. He was right. He discovered that Cersei Lannister's 3 children were not Robert's. He discovered that Jon Arryn had been murdered to keep exactly that secret. He discovered that the entire political structure of the reign was a lie. And then he did the thing that Ned Stark would do. He told the truth. He told Cersei that he knew and that he was giving her a chance to take her children and flee before he told Robert. He gave her warning because he believed in mercy even for people who did not deserve it. He told her what he knew because he believed that the truth mattered more than the political convenience of a lie. Cersei used the warning to act first. Robert died in a hunting accident that was carefully arranged to be fatal. Joffrey took the throne. When Ned moved to prevent this, when he tried to use the truth as a political weapon, as leverage, as the thing that would restore the proper order, he found himself alone. The allies he had counted on were not where he had placed them. The systems he believed would function as advertised did not function that way. He was arrested. Ned Stark died on the steps of the Great Sept of Baelor on the orders of a boy king, kneeling in front of his daughters and thousands of onlookers, on a charge of treason that was in every meaningful sense the opposite of what he had spent his life doing. It was not a surprise, given everything we have said about him. He was a man built for the North, deployed in the South. He was a man of absolute truth in a world that ran on lies. He was the most honorable man in a story that was specifically about what happens to honor in a world that has decided it cannot afford honor anymore. His death was the hammer that struck the bell. Everything that followed, Robb's war, Jon's watch, Arya's exile, Sansa's captivity, Bran's journey, rang out from that single stroke. Section 8, The Young Wolf, Robb Stark, and the War of 5 Kings. Robb Stark was 14 years old in the books, 17 in the show, when his father's arrest forced him to become the Lord of Winterfell. He was not fully prepared for this, no one would have been, but he was not without resources. He had been raised in the specific Stark tradition of knowing what the land expected of you and trying to meet it, of understanding that lordship was not primarily about privilege, but about obligation. He had been watching his father rule since he could form memories. He called the banners. He sent riders out across the vast distances of the north with the traditional summoning, and the response was almost immediate. 20,000 men gathered at Winterfell and began the march south because a Stark had called, and the north remembered that it answered to Starks. What Robb was going to do with this army once he had it was something that he figured out in motion. The initial purpose was straightforward enough. His father was imprisoned at King's Landing on false charges, and he was going to go get him. But the world did not wait for him to refine his objectives. Ned's execution happened before Robb could act, which changed everything. It was not a rescue mission anymore. It was something else. The men around him, the lords who had come at his call and who had now learned that the man they had come south to rescue was dead, made a decision. They stood in a field south of the Neck, and they began to shout, one by one, and then all together, a single phrase that had not been heard in Westeros in 300 years, not since the morning a king rode across the Trident and knelt. King in the North. They crowned Robb Stark with a makeshift crown, hammered bronze in imitation of the ancient First Men style, and declared him King in the North and King of the Trident. Robb was extraordinary on the battlefield. This needs to be said plainly, because the tragedy of his story sometimes obscures what came before it. He was arguably the finest military commander of the War of 5 Kings. He never lost a battle. In a war that was simultaneously being fought by Stannis Baratheon, Renly Baratheon, Joffrey Lannister, backed by his grandfather Tywin's considerable strategic genius, and Balon Greyjoy, Robb Stark was the one who came closest to total military dominance through pure battlefield excellence. He captured Jaime Lannister, the most feared fighter in Westeros, in a night ambush using half the men the battle would normally require. He moved faster than anyone expected, struck harder than anyone planned for, and maintained the loyalty of his men through a combination of genuine military competence and personal charisma. His direwolf, Grey Wind, fought with him. The bond between Robb and his wolf was a real and tactically significant thing. Grey Wind's instincts in the field were supernaturally good, warning of ambushes, unnerving enemy horses, giving the Stark forces an advantage that no general's manual would have a category for. The wolf and the king moved through the war as a unit, and the soldiers who saw this understood that it was meaningful, that there was something in the Stark blood that connected to things older and stranger than military strategy. But Robb was also, in the way that his father was, a man whose honor operated as both strength and vulnerability. He fell in love with Jane Westerling, Talisa in the show, a Volantene healer, and he married her when he knew he should not, had promised not to, because she had seen him at his most exposed and vulnerable, and he could not hold the political calculation above the human reality of what had happened between them. He had promised Walder Frey, the suspicious and resentful lord who controlled the crucial river crossing at the Twins, that he would marry one of Walder's daughters in exchange for safe passage. That promise had been the foundation of the entire campaign's logistics. Breaking it to marry someone else was not just romantic recklessness. It was a blow to the strategic architecture of the entire war. Walder Frey did not forgive. Walder Frey did not forget. And Walder Frey, approached by Tywin Lannister with an offer that made his long-nursed grievances suddenly actionable, agreed to do what no lord in Westeros was supposed to do. He agreed to violate the guest right. Guest right is the most sacred social law in the world of Westeros, older than any king or any institution, rooted in something fundamental about the relationship between host and guest that even the gods are understood to sanction. When a host offers salt and bread to a guest, when that guest accepts, a bond is created that neither party may break without drawing down divine punishment on themselves. It does not matter if the host hates the guest. It does not matter if the guest has wronged the host. While you are under their roof, eating their food, you are protected. Walder Frey served the salt and bread. He smiled. He played the music. He let the northern soldiers eat and drink until their judgment was cloudy with wine and their weapons were set aside. And then his musicians played a different song, the Lannister war song, The Rains of Castamere, a melody whose lyrics described the absolute annihilation of a family that dared challenge the Lannisters. And the doors of the hall opened, and the Freys who had not been drinking put on their armor and began to kill. The Red Wedding. There is a reason this event has entered popular culture as shorthand for a particular kind of betrayal, the kind that destroys you at your safest moment, that uses your trust as a weapon, that violates something so fundamental it leaves a permanent scar on the world. Robb Stark died stabbed by Roose Bolton, his own bannerman and collaborator, in the massacre. His wife died. Catelyn Stark, his mother, died. 3,500 soldiers camped outside the Twins were hunted down and killed. Grey Wind was killed in his pen, crossbow bolts fired through the slats. After the killing was done, the Freys cut off Robb's head, sewed Grey Wind's head in its place, and paraded the desecrated body around in public mockery. The war was over. House Stark had no king. Winterfell had been taken and burned by Theon Greyjoy, and then sacked again by the Boltons. The Bolton treachery was rewarded with the title of Warden of the North. The house that had spent 8,000 years building the North had lost everything, their seat, their lord, their king, and half their bloodline, in the span of a single violent season. It is worth taking a breath here and sitting with the scale of what the Red Wedding accomplished in purely practical terms, because it is easy to lose track of just how total the destruction was. Not only was Robb killed, but the 3,500 soldiers with him were killed. The army that had been the military expression of northern independence was gone. Catelyn Stark, the Lady of Winterfell, the woman who had been the North's diplomatic face and its behind-the-scenes political intelligence for years, was dead. Robb's unborn child, a possibility of continuation, a next generation in waiting, died with Talisa. Grey Wind died. The direwolf whose instincts had guided Robb's military campaign, whose presence had been a physical manifestation of the Stark bond with something older and more elemental than politics, died in his pen, killed by crossbow bolts fired through the slats while the hall rang with screams. The Boltons moved into Winterfell, What remained of Winterfell, which was not much, given that Ramsay Bolton had burned most of it before handing it back to the Stark forces, had not actually managed to hold it. They imposed their rule on the north with the particular brand of cruelty that House Bolton had been practicing privately for generations. The flayed man on their banner was not decorative. They flayed people. They were the family the Starks had been fighting for 1,000 years in the early history of the North. The Red Kings of the Dreadfort, who had submitted but never fully become something other than what they were. And now that the Stark check on their behavior had been removed, they showed what they had been suppressing. Roose Bolton was cold and calculating in his villainy, which made him in some ways more dangerous than his bastard son Ramsay, who was simply enthusiastic about causing pain in ways that eventually became counterproductive. Roose understood that terror was a tool with limits, that you could not flay every dissenter indefinitely without eventually running out of people willing to live in your territory. He tried, in his way, to make the Bolton rule functional. It was not possible. He had built it on too much blood, and the North had too long a memory. The Northern lords who had not been at the Twins watched what happened to the Stark forces and made their various calculations. Some bent the knee to the Boltons. Some waited in their castles and kept their own counsel. House Manderley, the family that ruled White Harbor, the only real city in the North, whose considerable wealth and fleet made them an important power, publicly bent the knee while privately grieving and quietly planning revenge. Lord Wyman Manderley served the Boltons their own flesh at a feast, if the most disturbing interpretation of the Frey Pies incident is correct. The North, in other words, was never fully the Boltons. It submitted, but it did not accept. And yet, 4 children were still alive and moving through a broken world, carrying something forward that neither the Freys nor the Boltons nor the Lannisters quite knew how to kill, because it was not entirely material. It was a name. It was a way of being in the world. It was what Ned had passed to Robb, and Robb had passed to the Northern lords, who still, in their hearts, meant it when they said the words. The North remembers. It was not merely a defiant slogan. It was a description of a real quality, a loyalty that lived in the bones and blood of the people the Starks had spent 8,000 years making themselves worthy of. Winter is coming. We will remember. We endure. Section 9. The Scattered Wolves, Arya, Sansa, Bran, and the Path Back. When a family shatters, the pieces do not fall neatly. They scatter in ways that seem random until you look back at the paths and realize that each trajectory was its own story, its own education, its own preparation for something that none of the travelers could yet see. The Stark children after the fall were not simply survivors of a catastrophe. They were each, in their separate and very different ways, becoming something that the catastrophe required them to become. Let us begin with Arya, because she travels the furthest and returns the most transformed. Arya Stark was 9 years old in the books when King's Landing swallowed her world. She was at the water's edge when her father's head came off the steps of the Sept. She was wearing a boy's clothes and carrying a needle-thin practice sword that a Braavosi dancing master named Syrio Forel had been teaching her to use. And she was close enough that she understood what she was seeing. Her family's household guard was massacred in the confusion. Syrio Forel bought her escape with a practice sword against 5 armored men and possibly died doing it, though the story is not entirely certain about his fate. She fled into the city. A young man named Yoren, a recruiter for the Night's Watch, hid her among the group of men he was taking north to the Wall, disguising her as a boy. She called herself Aery. She learned very quickly that if you wanted to survive in the world she had suddenly been deposited in, you had to not be Arya Stark. You had to be whoever the situation required, and you had to hold Arya Stark somewhere private and protected while the outside face did what needed doing. This was the beginning of something that the Faceless men would later try to complete. The journey to the Wall that Yoren was trying to make never succeeded. They were captured by Lannister forces and taken to Harrenhal, that enormous ruined castle in the Riverlands, whose history was already steeped in catastrophe before the war got to it. There, Arya did something that would have astonished her own family if they could have seen it. She befriended a faceless man. Jaqen H'ghar was one of 3 prisoners transported in a cage with Arya's group, and Arya showed him a kindness, a small one, unlocking the cage when fire threatened them. He owed her 3 lives, he said. She could name 3 people, and he would kill them. She used 2 of her names deliberately, and the third in desperate improvisation. She named Jaqen himself, which forced him to make a bargain with her, which resulted in the liberation of Harrenhal and something else. A coin. A strange iron coin that, if shown to any man from Braavos with the words Valor Morgulis, would set wheels in motion. She did not go to Braavos immediately. She traveled with the Brotherhood without banners, a ragtag group of outlaws and idealists who had appointed themselves the protectors of the common people in a war that was destroying the common people. She saw her brother's camp from a distance. She was brought to the Red Wedding by the Hound, herself as prisoner, and arrived in time to see the carnage from outside the gates, close enough to understand that the king she had been riding toward was gone, and that there was nothing to go back to. Eventually, she crossed the narrow sea. She found the House of Black and White in Braavos, that strange black and white temple on a tiny island in the harbor where the faceless men, those strange assassin priests who worshipped the many-faced god of death, did their work. She entered. She asked to become no one. The faceless men have an ancient history that connects, interestingly, back to the Valyrian freehold that we discussed at length earlier. They began in the slave mines of Valyria, in those volcanic depths where the victims of Valyrian blood magic's appetite for labor worked themselves to death by the thousands. The first faceless man was a slave who heard all the prayers of the dying and concluded that every prayer, regardless of the god invoked, was ultimately a prayer for the same thing: release from suffering. He became an instrument of that release. He gave people death when life had become a torment. And then, gradually, he and those who followed him refined this into something more systematic, a guild of trained assassins who charged vast sums to deliver clean, certain death to those whose deaths were requested, funded in part by their services to the rich, and in part by their service to something larger than wealth. What the faceless men required of Arya was this: stop being Arya, shed the name and the history and the kill list and the fury, and become no one, a blank instrument of the many-faced god whose death belonged to the god and not to personal revenge. She could not do it. She tried. She was very good at many parts of the training. She learned stealth and poison and observation and the art of lying with your whole body, not just your words. She was blinded as punishment for exercising judgment the many-faced god had not authorized. She regained her sight. She refused to kill Lady Crane, the actress she had been assigned. She declared herself Arya Stark of Winterfell and came home. But she did not come home empty. She came home with the skills of a faceless man and the identity of a Stark, which turned out to be the combination the world actually required. She returned to Westeros carrying a face she had taken from the twins, and she used it to serve the wine at a feast, and she made Walder Frey eat his sons, and she cut his throat, and she killed every male Frey she could reach after that, because the old gods and the new might not have delivered justice for the Red Wedding, but Arya Stark had decided to do it herself. She returned to Winterfell. She knelt with Sansa in the Godswood, and they talked in the way siblings who have survived terrible things talk, without quite saying the worst of it aloud, but meaning it anyway. And she was home. Sansa Stark's journey was different in almost every particular from Arya's, but no less transformative in its ultimate result. Where Arya escaped the Lannister court and survived in the wild margins of a war, Sansa remained in the court, captive, hostage, a political object that various powerful people moved around the board for years. Where Arya survived by becoming harder, sharper, more dangerous, Sansa survived by becoming more subtle, more attentive, more skilled at reading the rooms she was trapped in. At the beginning of the story, Sansa is the Stark child who fits most easily into the world of southern chivalry and courtly romance. She loves songs about knights and beautiful women and true love, and she sees Joffrey Baratheon through the lens of those songs rather than through the evidence her own senses are providing. It is not stupidity, she is genuinely intelligent. It is inexperience and idealism, and the particular blindness that comes from wanting something to be true badly enough that you stop evaluating whether it is. King's Landing cured her of this, though the cure was brutal. Joffrey revealed himself to be a sadist of the First Order. Her direwolf, Lady, the one she had named Lady, the most formal and courtly name, the most appropriate name for a direwolf belonging to a lady-in-waiting, was killed by her own father's sword on Joffrey and Cersei's demand, a consequence of an altercation in which Sansa had prioritized her relationship with Joffrey over her loyalty to Arya. It was the first lesson, administered immediately, in what the consequences of choosing the wrong alliance looked like. Then her father was arrested. Then he was executed. Then she was a hostage of the family that had killed her father, forced to attend the throne where Joffrey sat, forced to praise him when he hurt her, forced to be grateful for small mercies from the Hound, who gave her his cloak to cover herself when Joffrey had her beaten in public. She learned. Every day was a masterclass in observation, in the performance of loyalty, in how powerful people think and what they want, and how to give them just enough of it to survive. Cersei Lannister, Marjorie Tyrell, Peter Baelish, all of them used Sansa in one way or another, and all of them, without intending to, taught her. She eventually escaped King's Landing with Littlefinger's help, which turned out to trade one form of captivity for another, though the second was at least less immediately dangerous. From the Vale, she was delivered to the Boltons at Winterfell, an arrangement Baelish brokered without her meaningful consent, and she was married to Ramsay Bolton, perhaps the most purely sadistic character in the entire story, a man who made cruelty into something like an artistic practice, and who practiced it on her without mercy. She endured that too. She escaped, eventually, with Theon Greyjoy's help. Theon, who had been her childhood companion, and had then betrayed Robb and been destroyed by the Boltons, who found his way back to himself in the act of helping her. They made their way into Jon Snow at Castle Black. Sansa and Jon, who had never been particularly close as children, she his brother's half-blood, he the bastard she could not quite bring herself to fully accept, found each other across the ruins of everything they had been before, and it was enough. It was something to build on. Sansa coordinated the Battle of the Bastards. Not Jon. Sansa understood Ramsay's psychology in a way Jon did not, understood the traps he would lay, but failed to communicate her understanding clearly enough or early enough. She had summoned the Knights of the Vale on her own authority, a bold use of power that she had never been granted but had decided to claim anyway, and their arrival turned a catastrophic defeat into a victory. She fed Ramsay to his own dogs, watching with a calm she had earned through everything he had done to her. She became the Lady of Winterfell, while Jon was crowned king in the north. She managed the castle, the provisions, the political relationships with the northern lords, while Jon went south to parley with Daenerys Targaryen about dragons and armies and the threat beyond the wall. She was not wrong to be suspicious of Daenerys. She saw more clearly than Jon did, who was falling in love, what the Dragon Queen's absolute certainty about her own right to rule might mean for the North's independence. When the Great War was over and the dust had settled and Jon's impossible revelation of heritage had revealed that he was both a Stark and a Targaryen and therefore had a better claim to the Iron Throne than Daenerys herself, Sansa told Tyrion. She told him because she understood that Jon's claim was a danger to Daenerys that would sooner or later become a danger to Jon, and that the information needed to be in the right hands before it destroyed the alliance they needed to survive. Whether she understood all the consequences of telling is something the story leaves slightly ambiguous. What is not ambiguous is that by the time everything was over, Sansa was the one who declared northern independence as a condition of Bran's election to the throne, and got it, and came home to Winterfell to be crowned queen in the north. It was everything she had been going toward, though the road was nothing like the one she had imagined from the beginning. Bran Stark's journey is perhaps the strangest of all, which is saying something given the journeys everyone else in this family took. He fell from a tower window in the opening episodes of the story and was not expected to live. He did not fall accidentally. He was pushed by Jaime Lannister, who had been discovered by young Bran in a compromising position with his own sister, and who made a very quick and very cold calculation that a dead child was preferable to a witnessed secret. Bran survived the fall, but the damage to his spine left him permanently unable to walk, and the coma he fell into afterward opened in him something that had always been there but had been dormant. The three-eyed raven. The green sight. A crow appeared in his dreams. It had 3 eyes, the third full of a terrible knowing. It told him to fly. He followed it, through layer after layer of dreaming, to places that were not quite memories and not quite visions, places where the Weirwood network met consciousness and history was not entirely past. When Bran woke from his coma, he was changed. The dreams continued. He began to warg into his direwolf summer, entering the wolf's mind, seeing through the wolf's eyes, a practice that gave him mobility even as his body was confined to the home that had become a prison. He had Hodor as his legs, faithful Hodor with his single-syllable vocabulary and his enormous gentle strength, carrying Bran wherever he needed to go with the uncomplicated devotion of someone who simply believed in the boy he was carrying. After Winterfell burned, after Theon's seizure of the castle and the Bolton retribution that reduced it to a smoking ruin, Bran traveled north. He traveled with Hodor and with the Reed siblings, Jojen and Mira, toward the three-eyed raven that called to him in dreams. He crossed the wall, he went beyond it, into the land where few living people went voluntarily, in the depths of a winter that was becoming something more than seasonal. He found the raven in a cave beneath an enormous weirwood tree, the raven who turned out to be not a bird, but a very old man, his body fused into the roots of the tree itself, sustained by the magic of the children of the forest who still lived in the cave around him. The man who had been Brynden Rivers, a Targaryen bastard from centuries past, who had ridden north after being exiled to the Wall and had given himself to the Weirwood Network and its endless green site, had been waiting for Bran. He had been watching with 1,000 eyes, and one. He had guided Bran here through dreams and visions because Bran was the one, the green seer whose powers exceeded any before him, the one who would need to carry this impossible archive of human memory and history forward into the world's next crisis. The training was not quick, and it was not easy. Bran learned to move through time with his green sight, watching events from the past unfold around him, unable to intervene, or almost unable, in ways the story hints at but never fully explains. Because the question of whether Bran's presence and visions of the past actually influenced what happened is one of the deeper mysteries of the magic. He saw his father as a young man at the Tower of Joy. He saw the origins of the Night King, a man of the first men, pressed against a weirwood tree, a dragonglass knife driven into his heart by the children of the forest, in a desperate attempt to create a weapon against the first men who were cutting down their sacred trees. He saw the Hodor moment, the tragic loop that revealed that Hodor's single word and broken mind were the result of young Bran accidentally crossing his own timeline and fusing past Hodor with future Hodor's chill moment of desperate effort. Hold the door. Hodor, hold the door. The tragedy of it is almost unbearable if you sit with it properly. A loyal, gentle man spent his entire life carrying the damage of a moment that happened because of the boy he was carrying. And he still came. He still held the door. He still gave everything. When the old three-eyed raven died, and the Night King broke into the cave, killing most of the children of the forest and Jojen Reed, and burning millennia of accumulated magic, Bran became the new three-eyed raven. He barely understood what that meant yet. He learned in the years that followed, sitting in Winterfell in a wheelchair with eyes that sometimes went distant and saw things nobody else could see, in a body that did not move, but in a mind that moved through all of recorded time with something like freedom. He was the one who confirmed Jon Snow's true parentage. He had seen the marriage ceremony. He had heard Lyanna's dying words. He held in him the truth that everything else had been built to conceal and protect. And he gave it, carefully, in the right moment, to the people who needed to know it. What Bran Stark became in the end is something that defies easy categorization. He was no longer fully human in the way the other Stark children were still human. He was something older, something that had absorbed so much of the world's memory that the individual person was sometimes hard to find inside it. When he was asked if he wanted to be Lord of Winterfell, he said no. When he was asked if he wanted to be king in the north, he said no. He had different obligations now, ones that belonged to a different scale. Section 10. The Starks reunited, Jon Snow and the legacy that endures. And then there is Jon Snow, the secret at the center of everything. The boy who was never fully inside his own family's story and who turned out to be its most important thread. Jon Snow grew up at Winterfell, understanding that he was Ned Stark's bastard son and nothing more. He grew up knowing the bastard's place, respected, loved, but always at the margin, always with the implicit understanding that he was not quite one of them, that Lady Catelyn's cold eyes followed him with a feeling he could not name but could certainly feel, that no place had been set for him in the crypts below the castle. He took the name Snow, the traditional bastard surname of the North, the name that meant belonging to nowhere even when you lived somewhere specific. He loved his father. He loved his brothers and sisters, particularly Robb, who never treated him as less than a full brother, and Arya, who was in enough of her own kind of exile from the world of stark propriety that she and Jon understood each other in a particular way. He carved out a life at Winterfell that was genuine and warm even within its constraints, and then he gave it up. He joined the Night's Watch at 14. He went to the Wall, to the ancient institution that the Starks had been filling with their own sons for 8,000 years, because he had decided that was where he belonged. He had been romanticizing it slightly, imagining a brotherhood of heroic men guarding against the darkness. And the reality of what the Night's Watch had become in its decline was a cold bucket of water over that particular fantasy. Most of the Watch's recruits were thieves, poachers, and men running from debts. The nights were long, the food was bad, the castle was cold and under-resourced. The Watch that had once been prestigious and powerful was a shadow of what it had been. But Jon was good at it. He was exceptionally good at it. He trained harder than anyone else. He rose quickly. He was given responsibility, and he met it. He was assigned to serve the Lord Commander, Jorah Mormont, a tough and experienced old soldier who recognized something in the bastard boy and made him his personal steward, a role that looked like servitude and was actually preparation, the closest thing the Watch had to officer training. What Jon encountered beyond the Wall, the range of experiences, tests, and revelations that came from his years in the Night's Watch, forms a journey that rivals and in some ways surpasses any other in the story. He went undercover among the wildlings, living with them for a year, fighting alongside them, loving one of them, Ygritte, whose death during the Battle of Castle Black was the specific heartbreak that comes from being genuinely torn between identities. He saw the army of the dead with his own eyes, not as legend or old story, but as an immediate, overwhelming reality. He was elected Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and promptly made decisions that were right and necessary, and that his own brothers murdered him for, because the Watch was not yet ready to understand what he understood. He died. He came back, resurrected by the Red Priestess Melisandre after she had failed at everything else and tried this out of desperation. He came back different, quieter, more certain of some things and less certain of others, stripped of the Watch oath that had defined him because the Watch's murder of him had technically released him from his vows. He went to war with Sansa to retake Winterfell. He was crowned king in the north. And then Bran told him the truth. His name was Aegon Targaryen. His mother was Lyanna Stark. His father was Rhaegar Targaryen. He was not a bastard at all. His parents had been legally married, which made him the legitimate heir of House Targaryen with a claim to the Iron Throne that superseded even Daenerys's. The man who had spent his entire life at the edge of belonging, the man who had been told by the shape of his own existence that he was an outsider, was actually the center of everything. The most legitimate claimant to power in the known world. The nephew of the queen he had fallen in love with. He did not want it. He never wanted it. Every time power was forced on him, Lord Commander, King in the North, rightful heir to the Iron Throne, he accepted it because refusing it would have been abandoning the people who needed him, and he could not do that. But he did not want it. He was his father's son in this, whoever you counted as his father. Ned Stark would rather have been at Winterfell. Jon Snow would rather have been anywhere that did not require him to be the pivot around which the fate of the world turned. He rode a dragon. This matters. He rode Rhaegal, the dragon that Daenerys named for Rhaegar Targaryen, Jon's biological father, and the dragon accepted him, recognized something in his blood, his Targaryen heritage expressing itself in the most literal possible way. He was not just Ned Stark's nephew bastard anymore. He was both things at once. He was the fire and the ice in one person, Stark and Targaryen, North and South, old blood and dragon blood, the Wall and what lies beyond it. The Great War was won at Winterfell, in the God's Wood of all places, in the very heart of what House Stark had always been. The Night King came, the dead army came, the living huddled in Winterfell's walls and fought and were overwhelmed and were nearly extinguished, and in the darkness of the God's Wood, with the weirwood tree and the carved face watching, Arya Stark came from nowhere, from no one, from the faceless men's training applied to a purpose they had never intended, and drove a Valyrian steel dagger into the Night King's eye. The Night King shattered. The army of the dead fell. The Wall had been built 8,000 years ago by a Stark to contain exactly this threat. The promise of that wall, the promise of 8,000 years of winter is coming, the long chain of Stark lords and kings who had never quite stopped believing in the cold thing that waited in the north. It all came down to a girl with a knife in a god's wood in the middle of the worst night the world had faced since the Long Night. She was Arya Stark of Winterfell. She was no one. She was both. What followed the Long Night was the final war, the war against Cersei in the south, and it was terrible in different ways. Not the alien horror of the dead, but the very human horror of what people do with power when they stop being afraid. Daenerys Targaryen, who had spent her entire life righteous and determined and driven by the belief that she was destined to break wheels and free people, looked at King's Landing as the bells rang surrender and chose to burn it anyway. The transformation of her from liberator to destroyer is the story's darkest moment, in a story full of dark moments, and it required Jon to do something that broke something in him permanently. He loved her. He killed her. He did it because she would have done it again and again, because the logic of absolute power pursued without restraint would have turned the liberation of Westeros into its incineration, because somebody had to stop it, and the only person in a position to do so was the one she loved. He was exiled beyond the wall for it, not executed. His Targaryen blood and the outrage of the unsullied forces made outright execution politically impossible, so they compromised on exile, sending him back to the Night's Watch, back to where he had started, back to the cold and the darkness and the free folk, who had always been more honest with him than anyone else. He led the free folk north into the lands beyond the wall, into the territory that the Night King's defeat had transformed from an existential threat into simply a cold place where people could live. He went north of the wall, not as exile, but as something else, something that needed a different word. The last shot we have of him is moving north through trees, Ghost, his white direwolf at his side, the wildlings around him, into a world that the story spent 8 seasons building up as the source of all darkness, which now had no darkness left in it. Winter had come and passed, and the people were still here. Conclusion: the family that remembered House Stark endures. This is the thing that keeps striking you when you trace the full 8,000 years of their history. They lose everything, repeatedly. They lose kingdoms and sons and daughters and the very walls of their home. They are scattered and betrayed and killed in spectacular and devastating ways. The world destroys them, and then the world needs them again, and they come back. They come back because they were never just a ruling family. They were a family that took the trouble to actually belong to the place they ruled. The North is not just a territory that happened to be governed by Starks for 8 millennia. The North is what it is because the Starks were in it, the Godswood because they kept it, the Wall because they staffed it, the memory of the Long Night because they refused to let it go, the loyalty of the Northern houses because they earned it generation by generation instead of simply demanding it. What distinguishes the Starks from every other great house in Westeros is this: when their time of testing finally came, the real testing, the one that had been promised in their family motto for 8,000 years, they were not found wanting, not collectively. Individually, they broke and stumbled and made catastrophic errors of judgment. Ned's honor left him blind in King's Landing. Robb's heart overrode his strategic brain at the worst possible moment. But as a family, as a thread of identity running through all of them, even when they were scattered to the 4 winds, they held. There is an exchange in the story that captures this perfectly. When Robb Stark is declared king in the North, the first words out of his bannermen's mouths are not calculations about advantage or alliance. They are a declaration. The king in the North. And it is not merely Robb they are honoring. It is 8,000 years. It is every Stark who ever stood at Winterfell's gates and looked north and said those words. House Stark's words are not about glory or power or dominion. They are about memory, about the responsibility of remembering something important, about never letting comfort make you forget the cold. Sansa took the throne that should have been hers from the beginning, by temperament and training and sheer survival. She is the queen in the North now, and she carries in her the education of the harshest possible schooling. Every lesson she was taught by people who wanted to break her, turned into instruments of governance. Arya pointed her boat west into unexplored waters, going looking for what is beyond the edge of every map, carrying the Stark curiosity alongside the faceless men's skills into waters nobody has charted. Where she goes next is the next chapter in the family's story, one that even Bran with all his green sight has not told us about yet. Bran rules the 6 kingdoms that remained after the North's independence, as the three-eyed raven on a throne made of swords, as an archive of human memory attempting to govern a human world. It is a strange assignment for a man who has transcended most of what makes governance difficult, but perhaps that is the point. The world that comes after the Night King and the Mad Queen needs something different from what it had before. And Jon is in the north of the north, in the places that were always there beyond the wall, which turn out to be just forests and tundra and space after all, now that the dead are gone. The story of House Stark is ultimately a story about what it costs to be the kind of people who remember things. It costs everything, it turns out. You carry the memory of the long night through thousands of years of relative peace, and everyone thinks you are eccentric or morbid or overly dramatic. You watch your children die for doing the right thing. You get scattered across the world in the service of duties that were assigned to your family before any of you were born. You face the actual end of the world with a knife and a training from people who wanted to erase you and the memory of everything your family died for. And you kill the thing that needs killing with everything you have left. And then winter is over, and spring comes, and the world is still here, and your name is still Stark. 8,000 years ago, a man stood at the edge of a volcanic peninsula and decided to build something that would last. He called it Winterfell. He called himself Stark. He looked north at the greatest threat the world had ever faced and did not flinch. And he built a wall between that darkness and the living world. And he charged his descendants to remember why. They remembered, right up until the moment when it mattered. In every generation, in every winter, through every catastrophe and every long stretch of peace that made the catastrophe seem distant and perhaps imagined, there was always a Stark who remembered, who kept the gods' wood, who sent men to the wall, who said the words and meant them. The family that carried winter is coming, like a promise more than a warning, who wore gray and carried iron and kept the old gods when the new ones arrived, who never forgot what the cold could do. They were there when the cold finally came again. And they held. Against all odds, across all the ruin, they held. And the north was theirs again. And the world was still here. And the spring came at last. And Winterfell still stood. Thank you so much for spending this time with me in the history of House Stark. If this journey through 8,000 years of one of fiction's most remarkable families gave you something, whether that is sleep or wonder, or just a quiet hour in a cold world, I would love it if you would like this video. Subscribing means you will be here when we go deep on the next great story. And there are so many more left to tell. Every part of this world has a history worth this kind of attention. We will get to all of it, one story at a time. Until next time, may your nights be quiet, may your winters be mild, and may you always remember what it is you are supposed to be remembering. Winter is coming, and we know what that means now. The North remembers, and so do we.